It's widely considered that November is serial killer month among the true crime circles. A little bit of a confession, I'm not the sort of person who thinks that the day that you're born determines all that much, and I'm sorry if your Mercury is in retrograde and this statement annoys you. With that being said, me as a cynic has to admit that it's a bit mad that not only was Carl Eugene Watts, aka the Sunday morning slasher, born in this month, we've got Ted Bundy, Moses Satole and Kristen Gilbert, who are just some of the names of other serial killers. And that's why this week for the anniversary, instead of speaking about a specific crime, I thought I would tell you about someone who was born on this day, the day that I'm recording. Today is the 29th of November and it's Rosemary West's 67th birthday. She is currently an inmate at HM Prison Newhall, where she is serving a whole life sentence. For the anniversary, I wanted to tell you about her crimes. So, welcome. Shwa-na-na-na, 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 shwa-na-na-na. If you haven't heard of Rose West, then you must not be from the UK. But even if you are familiar with Rose and Fred West and the horrors that took place at 25 Cromwell Street, I don't think that you know as much as you think you do. Before we get started, I will say 10 minutes. I do not have enough time to fit everything in. Of course, the things I miss out, you're probably going to let me know in the comments, but use the research, use the links that I've provided, and that will give you the full in-depth story. Before she met Fred and moved into the now infamous 25 Cromwell Street, before they became Britain's most famous couple, after Prince Charles and Princess Di, after the Beckhams for all the wrong reasons, Rosemary Pauline Letts was born in Northam, which is in Devon in England, on this day in 1953. She was one of 7 children born to poor parents. She was described as moody as a child and performed pretty poorly in school. That isn't surprising considering that she is said to have suffered terrible, horrific sexual abuse at the hands of her father throughout her entire childhood. I read that she molested her younger brothers, that she herself was molested by her older sister, so this family were messed up. While I don't believe that the pasts of serial killers does anything to justify their crimes, I do think that it's really important to know what can trigger and maybe sometimes cause someone to be that much more predisposed to violence. Of course, not all children who are abused become abusers, but you can't deny that in many cases, those who perpetuate sexual violence have had it happen to them in the past. In 1968, when she was just 15, Rose met Fred West. He was 27, a cool 12 years older than her, and unsurprisingly, she wasn't interested in him at first. He lived in a caravan park and he wasn't exactly a knight in shining armor, but after he promised her a good time, she decided to give him a go. Her dad was not completely thrilled by the coupling. He threatened to call social services, but this only prompted Rose to leave the family home permanently. You know, usually I would be surprised that the dad didn't follow through with the threat of alerting the authorities, because obviously his daughter's now off ski in the caravan park, but considering what he had put Rose through, the fact that he didn't isn't the worst thing that happens in this story. So by 1970, Rose is living in the caravan. She's had a baby called Heather and begun taking care of Fred's daughter Anne-Marie and his stepdaughter Charmaine. This is where things get awful, and this story, as you probably know, but just in case you're not aware, contains so many crimes committed against children. And it was when she was 17 that Rose committed her first murder. This would in fact be the crime that would see her convicted all those years later in 1995. Fred was in jail and Rose was left to look after 3 kids. The victim, Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine, she disappeared at the age of 8, and her friends and neighbours were just told that she had been sent to go live with her mother, but really she was buried in the garden. When Fred was released from prison, Charmaine's mum, Rena, who was his first wife, came looking for her, and you guessed it, Fred and Rose killed her too. She is actually the first murder they committed together. Rose and Fred married in 1972, and over the course of her life, Rose gave birth to 8 children, 5 of which were said to be fathered by Fred, and 3 by her clients, as she was a sex worker. I have read some reports that Rose's own dad may be the father of 1, if not more, of her kids, which kind of makes that threat to call social services on the age gap between Rose and Fred all that more strange. But in 1972, where we are now, when they just got married, there are still only 2 kids. The family moved into 25 Cromwell Street, and that is where shit truly starts to go down. I'm gonna stop mentioning specific years now because this story spans more than 20, but I'm gonna try and tell you things in the order of which they happened. The family home soon became a brothel, with Rose working as a sex worker for much of the time that she spent living there. It was also used as a boarding house, with rooms being converted and rented out. The cellar of their home was, to put it frankly, a torture chamber, and Fred's daughter, Anne-Marie, became one of its first occupants. She was subjected to horrifically brutal rapes by her father while her stepmom held her down. It became a regular occurrence, and their sadistic behaviour first extended beyond the family when they picked up a hitchhiking 17-year-old, Caroline Owens. After getting into the car with both Rose and Fred, she was offered a job as their nanny, and she took it. She didn't last long in the house after feeling uncomfortable with the couple constantly hitting on her. Rose walking around naked and making advances, so she left. But she soon ended up back at 25 Cromwell Street. Rose and Fred used to go on drives and pick up lone female hitchhikers. They were more likely to get into the car if a couple stopped. They'd feel a bit more safe with a woman there. Caroline, she got back in the car again, and when she got back to the house, things got dark. She was incarcerated, she was stripped, she was raped. And despite threats that she would be killed and buried in the cellar, she was able to make her escape and reported the couple to the police. Charges were brought against them. Incredibly though, Fred was able to convince a court magistrate that she had consented to the activities. Over the next several years, Linda Go, Lucy Partington, Juanita Mott, Therese Seinthaler, Alison Chambers, Shirley Robinson, and 15-year-old schoolgirls Carol Ann Cooper and Shirley Hubbard all became victims of the Wests. After brutal sexual attacks, all were murdered, dismembered, and buried in the cellar. There are 12 known victims of the Wests, and as you may have clocked, I've only named 11 because I have saved the worst until last. Fred West abused his eldest daughter, Anne-Marie, for her whole life, and when she moved, or she escaped as I would call it, he simply switched his attentions to her younger siblings, Heather and May. Heather resisted and told a friend about the going on, and the Wests responded by murdering and dismembering her. They buried her in the back garden, where their son, Stephen, was forced to assist in digging the hole, the grave, that would be his sister's burial place. Things started to unravel for the couple when Fred West was finally arrested in 1993, more than 20 years after their killing began, for raping one of his daughters, and Rose was also arrested for child cruelty. These charges initially brought no jail time because the children were too terrified, understandably, to testify against their parents. None of them wanted to end up under the patio, which was a frequent threat by mum and dad, like their big sister. But this did mark the end of their reign of terror because all of the kids were removed from the custody of the Wests, and it forced the police to ask the question, where the hell was Heather? The police grabbed a warrant, and when they searched under the patio, they discovered a leg, and then another leg, and then another leg. And as we know, 3 legs means more than one victim. Eventually, Fred confessed to every single murder that he stuck by Rose and said that she was innocent. She maintained that she was not involved in the murders, but the discovery of Heather's body cast doubt on her story, because how could she not have noticed her husband murder, dismember, and dispose of her own daughter under the patio in her own home? Fred West fell apart, and he kept Rose safe, but she wouldn't speak to him. She cut all ties with him. She didn't write him back when he sent letters. They appeared in court together. She wouldn't look at him, and Fred killed himself before he could be convicted. But Rose, her trial went ahead. There were piles and piles of circumstantial evidence, and our friend Caroline even took the stand. But this was the thing, the prosecution had to convince the jury that Rose was a willing participant and not the innocent, dumb housewife she was pretending to be. And this was when the police realised something that happened way back in the early 70s. Fred was in jail when little 8-year-old Charmaine was last seen. That meant that Rose had to have been the one that killed her, and that would mean that she knew exactly what was going on in her own house, and she could even be responsible for more murders than that of 8-year-old Charmaine. The trial took 31 weeks, but the jury's verdict was unanimous. On the 22nd of November 1995, Rosemary West was found guilty of 10 murders, and 25 years numerous appeals and publicity stunts later, she is still in prison, serving her life sentence with no chance of parole. The house on Cromwell Street in Gloucester was demolished a year after the trial, and there you have it. It's a mammoth story. But I only have 10 minutes to tell you about today, the day of recording, the 29th of November, being Rose West's birthday. And breathe. I'll see you next week.